Hello, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you're joining in from. Welcome to another live session at the Reactors. My name is Rav, and I'm the program manager here at Reactor London. Before we get into the session, please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We're all here to learn, so please be respectful to each other, please be kind, and please ask questions in the chat. Today, we're back with the second episode of 10 Tuesdays to AZ900. And today, we'll be talking all about the basic types of cloud services. If you missed the previous episode, I am going to add in the link to the playlist where you can catch up on the first episode. With that, I am now going to hand over to Johan, who will lead the session. Hi, Johan.
Hello. How's it going? I hope everyone can hear me, and I hope everyone can see my screen. I hope you can hear me clearly. By the way, I'm using a different mic today, so yeah, let's hope it works out. So, good evening or good morning wherever you are. I'm not sure. You might be, on the other side of the world for that matter. But welcome to the second session of 10 Tuesdays to Azure Fundamentals. Again, just thank you to the folks at Microsoft Reactor. Without these folks, we would not have been able to do this and be so organized. But I'm looking forward to spending this evening with you. At least in the UK, it's evening, and spending about an hour with you, chatting through the basic types of cloud services. Now, if you missed our first session, I'm going to do a brief introduction here. So my name is Johan Meiberg. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer with Microsoft here in the UK. I only arrived in the UK from South Africa last year, January. Previous role at Microsoft, I was a cloud solution architect, my first role at Microsoft. And then I found this role, which I think is much better suited to my personality and what I really want to be doing. So you'll notice here that I'm quite passionate about sharing knowledge, probably more passionate about people than computers for that matter. But I've included my email address, I've included my Twitter handle, and you will also see there my LinkedIn profile if you want to connect with LinkedIn. I live just outside of on the outskirts of London, still on the central line though, so pretty sort of quick entry into London. And I'm very into sort of water sports, anything to do with water, really, though nowadays mountain biking around the Epping Forest is taking quite a bit of my time. Maybe not over Christmas, I don't think I fit onto my bike anymore. Either way, that's enough of me. I don't want to harp on about myself for too much. It's not about me here. We are here to chat about Azure, right, and the basic types of cloud services. Now, you'll notice that I've segregated this into three areas, right? These are the main sort of areas, but there are more of them actually, right? You get like database as a service nowadays, blockchain as a service. But the reality is what we're referring to is we are referring to software that organizations like Microsoft is making available for you to use, and we are hosting these services in the cloud. And you'll see after today, I'm going to have a couple of slides around this, and then we're going to do quite a couple of demos, and I'll demo to you exactly what infrastructure as a service is, what platform as a service, and software as a service is. And hopefully from the demos, you will see the difference in how you manage these services. And that's exactly what it's about, right? It's about the way you manage your services, and that's what these services are all about. So if you look at this responsibility model, you'll notice that there's a green section and there's a blue section. And in the green section, we've got all the different components that you manage. Take note there that, let me just move my coffee before I have coffee spill number 2 of the year. You'll notice that if I'm managing my infrastructure on premises, in other words, in my own data center, I'm responsible for the storage, I'm responsible for the physical networking, the physical compute components, right? The host operating systems, and also for the rest of the stack, right? The virtual machines, possibly operating systems, different run times, etc. The minute I move into the cloud, And I might be doing this with a type of a lift and shift migration. There's a great opportunity for partners of Microsoft to do this, right? Where you might have 20 customers that are currently running 2 or 3 servers on premises, and there's opportunity to migrate those in the cloud and get some rebates out of that. But in the worst case scenario, you might be migrating these workloads into Azure, and you'll typically start on a like for like with virtual machines and migrate them into infrastructure as a service, right? And you'll notice with infrastructure as a service, you still manage most of that infrastructure, manage most of those components, but Microsoft manages the physical storage, the physical networking, and the physical compute that underpins those operating systems, right? Those virtual machines. So the responsibility just shifts over partly to Microsoft, and Microsoft or whatever cloud provider you are using. These are not necessarily Microsoft related. Every cloud provider really has these sort of services. So then you're just accountable for managing the actual virtual machine, the operating system, the different runtimes, the apps, and the data and access. And I will talk a little bit more about this stack in a couple of minutes. I've got a slide that kind of, sort of segregates these different services when we're talking about running applications. And then the third option there you'll see is PaaS, or platform as a service, right? As you can see there, that's infrastructure as a service. That is PaaS, or platform as a service. And with platform as a service, you'll see that the vendor, in your case here, it will be typically Microsoft, right, with Azure. Microsoft takes over the management of the virtual machine, the management of the operating system, and the management of the different runtimes, right? We'll talk about what these runtimes are in a minute. And that just leaves you with the management of your application, possibly deploying your application onto the platform, and then, the data your application generates and the access to that application. And again, I will demonstrate some of that for you in a few minutes. And then last but certainly not least, we've got software as a service. And as you can see at the bottom there, software as a service is generally the type of cloud services that we're used to using, right? I'm thinking of something like OneDrive, right? If you're using Microsoft OneDrive for your personal or corporate storage, think about it for a minute. You don't ever, when you create your OneDrive account, you never tell Microsoft, I want you to be running operating system A. I want you to run this on the .NET framework, for example, and tell us how to configure that. You don't. It's more like a turnkey type solution. And all you end up doing is you end up managing the data and the access to the application, right? And that's what software as a service is, right? Think of think of any cloud service. Think of the Meta group, right, and all their applications, Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook. You have no control over that underlying operating system and frameworks that they're running under the covers to get you these applications. You basically create an account, sign in, and off you go. Think of something like Netflix or one of those services, right? Disney Plus. That entire layer of the operating system and all that stuff is completely abstracted away from you. All you are doing is you are specifying how you plan to pay for the service, switching it on, and you start using it, right? And that's really all you have to do. So in the bigger scheme of things, you might find that this becomes more like a type of a roadmap, right? Where as you start your journey into the cloud, and if as a smaller organization, possibly you start looking at something like Azure to start migrating some of your workloads into the cloud, you might be forced initially to use the infrastructure as a service just because your application has got some dependencies that we don't cater for on the PaaS side, right? So you might be forced to go the virtual machine route, and that implies that, you first deploy your applications as virtual machines. You might then, on virtual machines rather, you might then make some changes to those applications over time, get them to be a little bit more stateless. Don't worry about that too much now, but ensure that they don't have dependencies on the operating system. And that allows you to move them over to some of the PaaS services, right? And then, maybe that's not part of your migration path to migrate services into the SaaS space. But if there was a roadmap like that, then that will typically how you end up going, right? If you were running something like SharePoint or Exchange on premises, you probably will skip the IaaS and PaaS service and go directly for Microsoft and Office 365 and migrate things like SharePoint and Exchange, your email mailboxes, right? You'll now migrate them directly into Microsoft and Office 365. Okay, so this is just and you'll probably see us coming back to this diagram quite a bit, because this is a major part of the exam, right? They will try to make sure that you understand what the differences are between infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. All right. I see there's some folks here from Central New Jersey. That's brilliant. I love that. We're a true global audience here. Okay, so I did promise you that we will delve a little bit deeper into this applications and runtime section here. So let's just take a look at what I refer to as the anatomy of an application. All right. I know this is probably quite corny as far as I'm concerned, at least, but it's important that you understand this, because these are the different building blocks that essentially change ownership when you start migrating into the cloud, right? Suddenly, you don't have to manage some of these components. Suddenly, you just become accountable for the application or for the operating system or for the operating system and the framework, right? So generally, when you build applications, your applications need to be hosted on something, and that something is typically a piece of hardware, right? There's no real way around that, right? There's going to be somewhere where there's a computer running, a server maybe. These things don't run on fax machines, right? And there's no post pigeons that send data to and fro, right? When it boils down to it, there's a piece of iron somewhere in a cupboard that is responsible for hosting whatever is running your application, right? So there's always hardware, and that hardware, in this case here, might be the physical piece of hardware. It might be a virtual piece of hardware. And by virtual, what I mean is virtual machine, right? So your application might be hosted on the physical infrastructure. It might be hosted on the virtual infrastructure. And by that, I mean virtual machines, right? Now, I'm going to do a demo around that, and I'll show you how quickly it is to create a virtual machine. And then I'm going to deploy, an operating system. Azure will do that for me. And then from there, I'm going to deploy, a framework. I'm going to probably deploy 2 of them, and then I'll deploy an application. All right. So there's always the physical host, and then there's essentially, the operating system. And the operating system, if I'm running apps on my mobile phone, the operating system is going to be something like iOS, Android, whatever you might be using. If I'm doing this in Azure, the host is either going to be a Linux virtual machine, or the host is going to be something like a Windows virtual machine for that matter, right? So it depends where and what you are typically running, what type of applications you are running, and that will determine, what that operating system is, also what that hardware is that's actually running your application. And then that brings me up to the framework, right? So if I was to build .NET applications, just as an example, the Microsoft development framework, then I will typically use something like .NET. If it was a web application, it'll typically be ASP.NET, right? If I was to build something like Node applications, it'll typically be something like Node.js. If I build applications that make use of PHP, right, then it'll be PHP that I will actually deploy. It might be Java applications, right? There's a massive range of different frameworks and languages that are supported, not just in Azure, but in other cloud services. In a worst case scenario, if you're running these services locally, you might have built your own framework in a sense. Not very likely, but the reality is I can probably put a dot, dot, dot there. I know my dots are not very round. I can probably put a dot, dot, dot there to say, your application might use the .NET framework, but it might also use something else, right? There might be one or more frameworks that underpins your application. And then last but not least, you've got your application, and this is essentially your source code, right? Your source code that runs on that framework, and once the framework is deployed on the host, you can on top of that operating system, then you will essentially be able to deploy your application on there. I see there's a question in the chat here, and don't worry, Ravi, I'm going to field some of these questions as we go. I can see the screen today. My setup is different. So it depends what you are talking about, Sarah. If you are talking about software as a service, you don't get a choice for the operating system. Even with some of the platform as a service components, you don't get a choice. But with other services, you do get a choice, right? On infrastructure as a service, you always get the choice because you are accountable for the operating system. And I think it'll probably make a little bit more sense when I've done the demo. All right, so this is generally, what a very simple application and the components and the building blocks that make up your application look like. There's a host, a virtual machine typically. The host, the virtual machine has got an operating system, Windows, Linux, whatever the case might be. Then you've got your different frameworks that runs the application, and then you've got the application itself, and that application sits on the framework, which in turn sits on the operating system, right? So that's a very sort of simplified, anatomy of an application and the different building blocks of these applications. So I did promise you that it's not going to be death by PowerPoint today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump straight into a whole bunch of different demos. Now, I want to just explain what we're going to be doing first, right? First of all, I'm going to do this in a couple of parts. We are first going to be looking at infrastructure as a service, right? And my theme this week is IoT, all right? It's just the best demos that I could kind of come up with, actually. So I'm first going to do the infrastructure as a service demo. For this, I'm going to install a Linux virtual machine. And this is, of course, my operating system. Then I'm going to install the framework, which will be essentially Node.js, right? That's going to be the framework. So my code will typically be written in JavaScript or whatever the case might be. And then the actual solution, the application that I'm going to be deploying is something called Red Node. Now, Red Node is a very sort of rudimentary sort of messaging system that allows IoT devices to send messages, and then I can go and create all sorts of different, rules and routings behind that, right? So I don't have a lot of experience with Red Node. That's not what this is about. But then I'll show you how I can get something like Red Node running on a PaaS service. And the first option is going to be running Red Node on the app service, right? The app service plan is going to give me the ability to run Red Node as a containerized application, but as a PaaS service, not as the infrastructure service. So then I don't have to actually manage the operating system. Then Microsoft will manage that operating system, and that's the important part here. And then we're going to move a little bit away from Red Node, and we are essentially going to focus on the Azure IoT Hub, which is another PaaS service that I'll show you that you can essentially switch on inside of Azure. We don't even prompt you for the operating system there. We don't prompt you for any frameworks. This is something that we just make work. And then the last option, I'll move over to SaaS services or software as a service. And then I'm going to demo something called Azure IoT Central, which is essentially an IoT solution for just plug and play, not plug and pray, as we used to do with Windows at times. This is a plug and play IoT solution that you can essentially just bring certain approved devices, and they can start sending telemetry data off into the Azure environment. Okay, so that's how these demos are going to be are going to be going, and I'm not going to waste any time and go ahead with that. I see Sarah is asking another question here. So solutions like Kubernetes and Docker are PaaS solutions. Yes, so Sarah, 100%. They tend to be PaaS solutions. But if you look at something like Kubernetes inside of Azure, Kubernetes actually has got an infrastructure and a PaaS footprint, right? So maybe a little bit too advanced the topic for now. But you know, there's an aspect of Kubernetes that has got a PaaS component, but there's also some virtual machines that'll get created from that actually is what you pay for. All right, so without any further ado here, let me run off to my different demos. So what you'll notice here is a couple of things. First of all, I created a couple of resource groups. Now, you might not be familiar with resource groups, and this is actually coming up later on in one of our other modules. But I want you to think of a resource group as a logical grouping or container that hosts certain services, right? So if you were, for example, wanted to provision 10 virtual machines for running something like an IoT solution, you might group them together in a resource group, right? So what I've done here is I've created 3 resource groups, one for infrastructure as a service, one for PaaS, and one for SaaS, right? Very, very straightforward. All right, so there's my infrastructure as a service resource group. You'll see currently it's still empty. I'm going to click on create here, and I'm just going to go with, virtual machine. So I'm going to search for VM here, and well, in actual fact, let me just go for VMs here. There's virtual machines, and I'm going to create a new Azure virtual machine. This might look slightly familiar from last week as well. I'm going to go for that dev subscription of mine. We'll talk about that in more detail in later weeks. And then I'm going to go for that infrastructure as a service resource group of mine. This is really just a hierarchical structure, very similar to a folder structure that I'm creating here and that I'm using. And I'm going to call this one the 10T virtual machine. UK South is the region that I'm planning to provision this in. And I'm not going to use any availability options. I'm going to go with Ubuntu, right? So surprise, surprise, this is a Microsoft initiative, but I've been skilling up on Linux over the last couple of years, and I'm actually quite grateful for that. So it's prompting me here. I want you to notice that it's prompting me for a couple of things. It's prompting me for the size of the virtual machine, right? So how much CPU and memory do you want under the cover here, right? And this is something, by the way, that I can go and change, right? So if I've created this virtual machine with 2 CPUs and 8 gigabytes of memory, and it's running under load and it's really struggling, I can go and change this at some point to 4 CPUs and 16 gigs of RAM, right? I might experience a couple of seconds of sort of, impact there by us changing that, but my virtual machine will be up and running on that hardware within seconds, actually, right? So it's very quick to do that, and this is part of the cloud sort of capabilities that you need to leverage. You don't always have to go for over-speccing your workloads because you don't want to change them afterwards. If you're not making these changes, then you're probably not getting some of the benefit of the cloud, if that makes sense. So I'm going to go with, 2 CPUs, 8 gigs of RAM, happy days. I'm going to specify a username here. My username is going to be Johan, and I'm just going to punch in a monster password there. It's actually not that big a monster password. Now, by the way, part of my infrastructure that I have to manage is I have to manage access to this virtual machine. And that means at this point in time that I'm going to select SSH, right? So by default, this is going to open up a port to the internet, port 22, and this will allow me to create a remote session with this virtual machine. And I'll have to tweak that in a bit when I've deployed this application on this virtual machine so that I can access the web application on there. I'm going to go next. You'll see that there's my disk options, right? I can And this is part of infrastructure as a service, right? I can go and add some additional disk space if I wanted to use some additional disk space, right? I'm going to go with networking next, and you'll notice that with networking, it's actually creating a virtual network called 10 IaaS VNet. It's creating a subnet inside of that. So most of the networking components that you might provision even on premises is also available for you to use here. And all of this forms part of that infrastructure stack that forms part of infrastructure as a service. And then I'm going to create a public IP address. Without that, I will not be able to connect to the virtual machine from the internet. And I'm going to not worry about the rest. I'm going to click on review and create here. And I'm going to give it a couple of seconds. And it will actually go and, create this virtual machine. Now, it's busy deploying this virtual machine as we speak, but I want you to notice that there's actually a template that represents this virtual machine. This is known as the Azure Resource Manager template. There you can see Resource Manager templates, right? Whoa, where am I now? Oh, I shouldn't have clicked there. I should have just hovered. So if I can, if you see there, Azure Resource Manager templates, and this actually, if you go and look at what this actually is, we refer to this as infrastructure as code, right? The ability for me to deploy all my services using text files, right? As opposed to a graphical sort of interface or even something like physical media. So it's giving me the like JSON data here that represents this virtual machine. And I can go and download this if I wanted to. I'm going to head back for the overview, and you'll see that my virtual machine is now up and running. I can actually click on go to resource, and you'll see that there is an option for me to stop the virtual machine. I can restart the virtual machine, and there you'll see there is a public IP address for this virtual machine. So my virtual machine is now up and running. There's a Linux Ubuntu virtual machine running inside Azure in one of our data centers on a physical host, and I can now start installing my frameworks on there, right? Okay, so remember, if I go back to this slide again, just give me a moment. So what I've got right now is I've got this part here, right? I've got my host, which is this point in time a virtual host, right? And it's running Linux. And now I'm going to start, deploying the framework, and then I'm going to start deploying the application. I want you to notice, though, that because this is infrastructure as a service, I'm responsible for updating the operating system. So the operating system and the patching of this operating system is on me. Microsoft has got some tools that will help me with that, but I need to configure those to work, right? So it's up to me to do this. This is not something Microsoft is going to be doing. All right, so let me stop waffling about there. There's my virtual machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just copy this URL, that IP address, and I'm going to crack open a little PowerShell here. There we go. Just drag it to this side here. And I should have SSH in there. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a remote session with that server, SSH to Johan at, and I'm just going to paste that IP address, right? It's prompting me to say, are you sure you want to connect? Yada, yada, yada. I'm going to stick in that password, and there we go. I'm connected. You'll notice here that I'm actually connected to the Ubuntu system. I'm currently on that virtual machine, and I'm logged in as the administrator, which is essentially the account that's got the most permissions on this environment. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to clear that out. So we've got some room for movement here. Now, first of all, I'm responsible for this virtual machine's operating system, right? So first of all, I want to ensure that the virtual machine is up to date. So I'm hitting the update here, and it's essentially doing what Windows in the Windows space will be a Windows update, right? This is what I'm busy doing now, but on the Linux side of things. So I'm going to clear that out. So now my virtual machine is up to date. All patches have been applied. Happy days. Now I want to come back here again, and my operating system is now running. It's up to date, and I want to start installing, the framework. And the framework that I need here is essentially Node, or as it's known, Node.js, right? So let's head back in there again. Oops, daisies. And I'm gonna install Node. This might take a couple of seconds. I'm just gonna say yes there, and thank you very much. Give myself time for a big sip of my semi-cold coffee here. It looks like it's a happy puppy. And I also need to install another framework called NPM. My demo almost broke there. Thank goodness I can read. But again, the point I want you what I want you to notice here is I'm on the operating system now. I'm doing stuff that actually in the cloud I don't really want to be doing, right? And it's taking some time, but this is the kind of thing that the minute we move to PaaS services, that Microsoft will start doing for us. Microsoft will maintain and update the operating system. Microsoft will maintain, the different frameworks, make sure they're up to date, install them, etc. All we have to do is bring our applications. So let's give this another couple of seconds. You'll see there it's at sort of 38% now. So I'm just going to give this a few more seconds. And of course, the commands I'm typing here is not really part of the course at all. I'm just doing this as a demonstration so you see the differences between infrastructure, PaaS, and software as a service. So I'll give this another few seconds. Looks like it's going to take another 99%. All right, this is where I just pressed the enter button a couple of times. Yeah, I can actually remove. So Ravi, I'm not sure if that's possible. I can switch off my. I can disable my camera. I'm not sure if you can see that. Look, to be brutally honest with you, you should not worry too much about the text if you're keen on reading the text there, Harry. So don't worry too much about that. All right, so now I've got my framework deployed, right? I've got my framework updated. Everything is good to go. Now it's time for my application. I will get to some of the questions a bit later on if you don't mind. I just want to finish the demos quickly. So now my operating system is up to date. My framework is deployed. It's time to bring the application. Right, and for that, I'm going to run this command, sudo npm install, essentially that Node-RED application of mine. And this should not take too long, actually. It's busy churning away there. See, there's a question about conditional access. Absolutely, Theo. You can. There's loads of conditional access policies that you can apply to that for sure. You can also use something like Bastion if you don't want the public port to be opened. Is it possible to remove the speaker video? I'll leave that for my colleague here. What if you already have the virtual machine ready? How do we deploy it? Well, if it's ready, then you just skip the first step that I took, right? The first step I took was to deploy the virtual machine. If your virtual machine is already there and running, connect to it and just install the framework and the application, right? That's all you have to do. I hope that answers that question. Hello, for infrastructure as a service, we are responding for OS update and patching. I'm not sure if that's a question, but it looks like actually, we've answered all the questions. Okay, so right now, I've done everything, right? If you take a look here, I installed the virtual machine, right? Well, Microsoft did that. I didn't have to do that. I patched the operating system. I deployed the frameworks that I needed to deploy the application, and I've now deployed my application as well. So let's take a look now and see what comes up next. The next thing for me to do is to actually run the application. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to run Node-RED, and you'll see that it's actually, at this point in time, it's actually running on localhost /port 1880, right? Now, if you remember when I provisioned the virtual machine, I opened up port 22 for SSH. Port 1880 is not available, right? So let's quickly open that port. This, again, is part of what Microsoft can help you with if you're running these in PaaS services. So if I go to my network here and I specify add inbound port, let me just get that port number, 1880. I'm going to specify 1880, and I'm going to say TCP port and hit the add button. So it's actually, I'm opening up a port now for that virtual machine. Created that security rule. Thank you very much. And now if I navigate to this http:// and I paste that URL, then you should see that this is going to run that Node application of mine. Ooh, let me, http:// IP address :1880. I must not forget the port. That was the problem there. Just give it a few seconds here. It is 1880, and I just want to check to see if it is the right port that I've got open here. 1880, that's correct. There we go. There's my application. Welcome to Node-RED. So it's running. Now I want you to keep in mind here that if there's an update to the Linux operating system with infrastructure as a service, it's up to me to go and apply that update. Microsoft has got some help there, but predominantly it's up to me to do that. If there's an update or a new version of the Node.js framework, I need to deploy that. If there's a new version of the application, I need to deploy that, right? I have to do everything almost, except for the physical hardware, to keep this application running. All right. That's the infrastructure as a service component. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to close that down, and let's move on to the PaaS service, right? So I've got this resource group called PaaS. So at this point in time, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to go the virtual machine route here. I'm going to go for the Azure App Service, right? And the App Service is essentially Microsoft's, web server type scenario, right? So we use this for web applications, right? Which this is, right? If you look at that URL I went to just now, it's a web app, right? So let's do this. I'm going to click on Create here, and I'm going to go for App Service. And I'm just going to go for web app here. Now, I want you to take a look at the differences here. I chose the operating system early on, I chose the username and the password and all that stuff. I chose the IP addressing, right? The disks and all those things. Now I'm doing the platform as a service component. All right. Let me just go for app services here. Just do it from here if it's all the same to you. So I'm going to select that same subscription, my dev subscription. I'm going to select that PaaS resource group of mine. I'm going to call this one 10P IoT so that it's got a unique name. You'll notice this will get provisioned on Azure Websites.net. And at this point in time, it's prompting me whether I want to run code, right? If I choose code, then there you can see, there's Node. If this was a Node application, I can choose Node, right? If this was a PHP application, I can choose any of those. I don't have to do it. Microsoft is going to do it. We are going to provision the virtual machine. We are going to provision the framework, and we will patch these things over time as well, right? You don't have to do that anymore. This is our responsibility now. I am, however, going to take this up a notch, and I'm going to deploy this application as a Docker application, right? So if you haven't heard of Docker, Docker is essentially a containerized framework for running containerized applications. You'll notice here that I actually have the option to choose the operating system, right? So I might still choose the operating system, but just because I choose the operating system doesn't mean I have to manage it, right? My application might want to run on Windows or might want to run on Linux for whatever reason. I get to choose it. And there I'm going to specify, UK South, which is closest to me. And I'm going to just, create a new plan, whatever the case might be. In fact, I want to go here with existing plans. And I want you to take a look here in terms of it looks very similar. It looks like a virtual machine. It smells like a virtual machine, but it's not really a virtual machine. Check it out. I've got, X amount of CPUs, right, that I can choose. Virtual CPUs, memory, the amount of storage I've got, right? But I don't have to manage any of these. I'm going to go with a standard option here and hit the select button. And then from a Docker perspective, I'm going to point it to Docker Hub, and I'm just going to say red node. Whoopsie, that'll be red node /red node. And that should be that. I'm going to click on next, hit the review and create. I want you to notice here that with my virtual machine, there's a whole host of infrastructure service that I need to manage. My networking, my disks, right? These sort of things, the size, etc. There's things like, additional extensions, a whole bunch of additional things, right? Auto shutdown, these sort of things, updates that I have to manage for my virtual machine on the infrastructure as a service side of things. On the PaaS service, and I'm not going to have to do that. I've got some other capabilities though, right, that I can use for that, but I don't have to go and manage all of those things. And there you can see my application deployment is complete. I go to the resource, and all it gives to me here gives me a URL, right? I can click on the URL, and it's giving me an application error. Let's just give it a few more seconds. I'm going to give it some time just to see if it's going to come through. Not sure why it's doing that. Should not be doing that. It should be the same application that I showed you earlier on. You know what I'm going to try? I'm going to try it just on HTTP. Let's see if that works. Right. At the moment. It's bombing out here for some reason. She's not a happy puppy. And one last try here. Not sure why it's doing that, but it is what it is. At this point in time, I'm not going to troubleshoot it. Suffice to say that it has worked about 6 times so far. All right, that there wasn't any issues with that. I'm not going to try to fix it now. That's not the purpose of the exercise here. The point I'm trying to make here is, it feels really hot in here suddenly. But the point is, at this point in time, all I'm doing is, and I can still manage this application of mine, but you'll see here that my capabilities are completely different, right? If I wanted to give someone access to the application, I can go and configure my authentication to the application, right? I can do things like backups. There's my custom domains, just as an example, that I can bring to the party here, right? Couple of options. So at least from a deployment capability and from a management capability, now Microsoft is taking control of that app, of that virtual machine, and of the different frameworks. It's not something I have to take care of at this point in time, right? Okay, so I'm not gonna worry about that too much. I'm gonna give it a quick restart here and see if that really makes a bit of a difference. Maybe it does. Restarted the web application, and let's just hit the refresh here and change it to HTTP. No, it's not happening. It is what it is. All right. So I've got another demo as well, right? So the next is now, by the way, RedNode is an IoT, open source IoT platform. I want to demonstrate another IoT platform, and this is the Azure IoT Hub, right? And I actually have an IoT Hub here. So if I click on IoT Hub, there you can see there's my IoT Hub inside of Azure, right? Right now, there's nothing happening here. It's just empty. By the way, if I provision an IoT Hub, you'll notice that at no point in time does it prompt me for the operating system. And you see, this is also a PaaS service. It's not prompting me for operating system here. It's not prompting me for RAM. It's prompting me, Christoph, that's 100% right. Eh? I must remember that the demo gods require me to at least sacrifice 5 or 6 chickens the night before. I only sacrificed 2 chickens. That is really, me being sarcastic. I did not sacrifice anything except my ego here went up in flames. But either way, the point I'm trying to make is certain PaaS services, and to come back to Sarah's question, we are not even going to prompt you for the operating system. We will manage that, and we know what needs to be provisioned in the background for that, right? So there you can see there's my IoT service. If I go for devices here, then you'll notice that I can go and add a new device. I'm going to say that this is the 10T demo device. And I'm just going to hit the save button. It should appear here in a few seconds, actually. And that actually gives me a connection string. And I've got another demo here of a Raspberry Pi service that I can now go and paste that connection string in and hit the run button. And it's essentially going to start sending messages to that IoT service. And you'll see within a few seconds, you will see that there's going to be some messages coming through here in a moment, right? If I just hit the refresh button here, you'll see some messages coming through momentarily. There you can see there's one IoT device connected. And if I just hit refresh, then you'll see there's a number of messages received, should go up in a few seconds. Again, the point is, I don't have to manage the operating system. Microsoft is managing the operating system. It does take some development capabilities from my side, but it's just a question of managing access to the application and the data that it essentially generates. So let's just give that a couple of seconds here, and you should see some of that data. My Raspberry Pi is busy churning out message number 28 now already that it's sending to the IoT service. And if I hit the refresh button there, I'm hoping that some of those messages starts appearing here within a few seconds. messages used today for, but it's not actually showing that, right? So let me just hit the refresh, and I'm actually going to go down the section here to metrics, and I'm going to go with telemetry messages sent. Let's go with telemetry, total devices. Let me just find some metrics here. Go on. It usually takes about 2 minutes for it to come through here, so you're not going to see it, some of that here, but you'll see there that, it's already used X amount of messages. And, those messages will start feeding through here at some point in time. All right. So as you can see from this service, I still need to do a little bit of work to actually get this thing up and running. But Microsoft is taking care of the underlying operating system. Microsoft is taking care of anything under the covers that if I was to run an IoT solution on a virtual machine, that I would have to take care of, right? So let's go to the last demo here. And the last demo is a SaaS service, or software as a service. This is typically just a switch it on type service, right? I'm going to see if I can come back to that demo momentarily. I don't have a lot of time here, but the last option is a SaaS service, and you'll see here that as a SaaS service, essentially it gives me a URL, right? I provisioned this earlier on because it takes a bit of time to provision this, and you'll notice that this is known as the IoT Central application. Right now, if you think of that IoT service I provisioned earlier on, I'm writing code to send messages to this thing. Think of a service like this one where you'll notice that I don't have to write any code. All I have to do is I have to bring my devices, right? And if I go for example, to my dashboards here, then you'll see that there's already some dashboards, right? Some services are online. You can see there's some telemetry data. So this is a software as a service component, and at this point in time, I don't have to do any development. All I have to do is I have to bring my devices. So if I go for device templates, you'll see I can click on the new button there, and there you can see if I scroll down a section, let's use some random one. Where's a good one? Let me just quickly check. There's a good one, right? The Agora option satisfaction terminal, right? I can hit next and review and hit the create button, and this will essentially allow me to bring devices like this one, the 3-button survey, and all I have to do is Microsoft is certifying these devices as compatible with this service, and all I have to do is plug in my device, configure it to work with the Azure IoT Central application, and it's going to start sending telemetry information in here that I can actually go and analyze and put into these dashboards and actually, reset my device from here, etc., etc. You'll see there's some sample data, all right? So if I have to contrast these services, infrastructure as a service, and let me just pop back onto the slide just briefly. If I have to contrast these services, just in summary, infrastructure as a service, typically things like the virtual machines, access via ports, remote connections, the patching that I have to do. On the platform as a service side, we're talking about more developer-centric services, managing those apps and the access to the application, but not the infrastructure. You typically have a lot less control here, but sometimes more capability because we're really enhancing these things and that sort of thing. And then last but not least, on the SaaS side, you'll notice that you don't really have any control over the operating system or the underlying infrastructure for that matter, this is something you just switch on and start using. Takes very little code or development for that matter for this to actually work. All right, and that leaves me with, I think, about 4 minutes for questions. I hope that those demos. My word, can you believe that? I'm going to fix that quickly. It is red node. Thank you very much for that. Node red. Ooh, I'm happy you mentioned that. So I'm going to quickly demo that while I'm waiting for questions. Any questions?
So we'll start off with the top, Johan. The first question is, do you get to choose the OS when there's choice?
So I'm not sure what that question means, to be brutally honest. Do you get to choose the OS when there's choice, right?
So I think
So with certain services, you get to choose the operating system. With infrastructure as a service, you always get to choose the operating system. With PaaS, you sometimes get to choose the operating system. With SaaS, you never get to choose the operating system. I hope that's clear.
are you able to apply conditional access rules to the remote SSH port?
Yeah, for sure. But this is a much bigger sort of conversation, actually, Theo. So with conditional access, you should be able to control this, at least if your machines are kind of connected or joined to the Azure AD for that matter. But if I'm just thinking off the cuff now, if your devices were just coming from the internet, probably not. So then you might have to deploy something like Microsoft, group policies to manage some of those components. But yeah, it depends. We can maybe take this offline at some point in time.
What if you already have the virtual machine ready? How do we deploy it?
It depends what you mean by ready, Sarah. Do you mean you've got the virtual machine running on your local device? Because if that is the case, you will take the VHD file, copy it to an Azure storage account, and then create the virtual machine with the VHD file from the storage account. And then eventually convert the VHD file to a managed disk. It's a little bit technical for this session, but there you have it. I hope that answers that question. I see there's another question. There is the Node-RED app already packaged. It is actually a let me just select the resource group here. It is actually a containerized application. Just going to call it Node-RED new. Whoa. Go for the Docker container here. I'm going to make this demo work, even if it's the last thing I do. Just go for that plan. It's already 7 o'clock, so if some of you have to drop, I can totally understand that. Let's go with the standard plan here. Okay, so I'm going to go with Docker next here. Go with Docker Hub. Node-RED. Let's try that to daisies. I'm going to give this one more swing here. Review and create. Let's give this a few seconds. So thanks for that tip. I got that wrong. It's the only thing I didn't have in my Stream Deck. Do you have any DevOps fundamentals? I'm not sure about that. Maybe a little bit later on, maybe later in the year, you should check back on that. Can you reuse the operating system license from on-prem? Only for Windows, of course, but you can definitely do that. Are we going to cover DevOps fundamentals? Hopefully we do. Ravi, I hope at some point we get to do that. Can we integrate Microsoft 365 with Azure? They are, in a sense, already integrated, to be honest with you. They are integrated because Azure AD is the identity platform for both of them. And there we go. I think the application should be running now. Node-RED. So I'll give it a few seconds. But this is on the PaaS side, of course. It looks like it's a happy puppy. It's busy warming up, and it should be good to go. So you can definitely reuse those operating system licenses for Windows. If you're planning to migrate your workloads to the cloud, you can absolutely do that. Come on, Node-RED. Just taking a little bit of time. At least I'm not getting that error immediately. So that is good to see. And I suspect we will see that Node-RED application coming up in a moment. Any further questions? I hope I answered all those questions. After this part of the demo, I'm going to, we'll probably end this quite abruptly, but I do hope that that was valuable for you, and I hope you learned a couple of things.
Yes, I don't think we have any more questions.
All right.
But yeah, I think we can wait until.
We don't have to wait for this to come through then, really. So let's, it might, I might come through. It'll take some time. It's busy deploying the containerized application. So if it just takes another couple of seconds, I will probably not be too surprised. We're already 4 minutes over time here. Let's give it another minute, shall we, until 5 past?
Yeah, yeah, why not? Yes, why not?
I'm not sure how many people are still on the call, actually.
I think they're all waiting.
Really?
Yeah, we've got about 76 people.
This will drive me completely crazy. And even if we're in the call now, I will probably be doing this and making sure this is working. Trying to understand. Well, it's 5 minutes past now.
Yeah.
Ravi, it's entirely up to you. If you want to then we can, more than happy for us to stop this. It's probably not necessary for this to go through. But yeah, this application will load in a few seconds. And you'll notice that I didn't have to configure the host operating system. I didn't have to deploy something like Node.js for that matter. I did absolutely, all I did is I just said what application I want to run, and the platform as a service component ran the application. I did choose the operating system and these sort of things, and the amount of CPU and RAM. And as you can see on the IoT side of things, I did not even do that, right? It just did all of that on its own. So while this thing is loading, thank you very much. While this thing is busy loading, let's rather call it a day. I hope that made sense for you. Yeah, let's see if we can take this further next week.
Yeah, we'll see you all next week. Same time, same day for the third episode of 10 Tuesdays. With that, have a lovely evening or rest of the day, wherever you are. And we'll see you next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a great evening.